Imagine it's the middle of winter 30,000 years ago. You wake up before sunrise, but it hardly matters. The sky is already gray, and within a few hours it will be dark again. Outside your shelter, snow reaches almost to your knees. Every breath stings your lungs. Every step crunches loudly enough that anything nearby already knows you're coming. You haven't eaten a proper meal in 3 days. The last herd you followed disappeared over the hills nearly a week ago. The berries that covered the valley all summer are long gone. The river that once supplied fresh water is buried beneath a thick sheet of ice. Inside your shelter, a small fire is still burning, not because you slept well, because someone stayed awake all night making sure it didn't go out. So how did anyone survive an entire winter without farms, supermarkets, insulated houses, or central heating? For ancient humans, winter wasn't simply another season. It was the most difficult examination nature could give. And surprisingly, many of the behaviors that define us today may have been shaped during those long, freezing months. Today, winter is mostly an inconvenience. You complain about scraping ice off your car, you turn up the heating, you wear a thicker coat, and count the days until spring. But for most of human history, winter decided whether your family would still exist by the time the snow melted. Every frozen morning represented another day your food supply became smaller. Another day your firewood pile became shorter. Another day your body burned precious calories simply trying to stay alive. And here's what's interesting. Winter wasn't won in winter. It was won in autumn. Long before the first snowfall, experienced hunter-gatherers were already preparing for a season they knew would test everything they'd learned. As summer faded, the landscape began sending warnings. The days grew shorter. Birds disappeared from the sky. Large herds changed their migration routes. Plants stopped producing fruit. To an inexperienced person, those changes meant little. To someone who had survived 10 or 20 winters, they meant one thing. The clock was ticking. Unlike us, ancient humans couldn't drive to another town if food became scarce. They had to predict the future using nothing but observation. Miss the annual migration of reindeer, and your group might spend weeks without enough meat. Fail to gather enough firewood while the forests were still dry, and you'd be trying to burn frozen branches in the middle of January. Forget to repair your clothing before temperatures dropped, and the cold itself could become your greatest enemy. Archaeologists have found evidence that many prehistoric groups planned these seasonal changes with remarkable precision. At sites across Ice Age Europe, enormous accumulations of animal bones reveal something surprising. These weren't random hunting successes spread throughout the year. Many appear to represent seasonal hunting events where groups worked together to harvest large numbers of animals in a short period. The timing wasn't an accident. Winter was coming. Take reindeer, for example. Every autumn, massive herds migrated across northern Europe, creating predictable opportunities for hunters who understood their movements. A successful hunt didn't just provide food for dinner, it could determine whether an entire community survived until spring. And here's the part most people don't think about. Meat wasn't even the most valuable thing those animals provided. Fat was. Today, fat has a bad reputation. 30,000 years ago, it was one of the most precious resources on Earth. Your body burns enormous amounts of energy trying to maintain its temperature in freezing conditions. Without enough calories, especially fat, even healthy people begin losing strength surprisingly quickly. That's one reason archaeologists often find that prehistoric hunters targeted large animals like bison, wild horses, reindeer, and, in some regions, mammoths. These weren't simply the biggest animals. They were walking energy reserves. Nothing was wasted. The meat fed the group, the marrow hidden inside bones was rich in calories. The hides became clothing and blankets. The sinew became thread. Bones became needles, awls, spear points, and tools. Even antlers found new purposes. To modern eyes, it looks incredibly resourceful. To them, it was simply survival. One of the most fascinating discoveries comes from places like Dolní Věstonice in the Czech Republic. Around 30,000 years ago, people living there weren't just hunting mammoths. They were building sophisticated communities. Archaeologists have uncovered evidence of organized living spaces, hearths, artistic objects, and careful planning, proving that Ice Age people weren't constantly wandering in search of food. Some stayed in seasonal camps for extended periods, preparing carefully for harsh winters. But food alone couldn't save you. Fire could. Today, if your heating stops working, you call someone. If your stove breaks, you order another. Ancient humans had no backup plan. A fire wasn't a convenience, it was life itself. It provided warmth, it melted snow into drinking water, it cooked frozen meat, it dried wet clothing, it scared away many predators, it created light after sunset, and perhaps most importantly, it allowed people to stay productive after darkness fell. That's why tending the fire may have been one of the most important jobs in the entire camp. Archaeological sites such as Gesher Benot Yaakov in present-day Israel preserve evidence of controlled fire use dating back hundreds of thousands of years, showing just how deeply fire became woven into human survival. Exactly how reliably different human groups could create fire from scratch at various points in prehistory is still debated. But one thing is clear. Once a fire existed, losing it carried enormous consequences. That meant people prepared for winter long before temperatures dropped. Dry branches were gathered months in advance. Larger logs were stored where moisture couldn't reach them. Even partially frozen wood could be split open to expose the dry timber hidden inside. Every piece of fuel represented another few minutes of warmth, another pot of melted snow, another night the children could sleep without freezing. And then there was clothing. Many people imagine prehistoric humans throwing rough animal skins over their shoulders and calling it a day. The archaeological evidence paints a much more impressive picture. Bone needles dating back more than 40,000 years have been discovered across Eurasia. These weren't crude tools. Some have tiny eyes carefully drilled into them, making them remarkably similar to sewing needles used until relatively recent history. That changes everything. Instead of wrapping yourself in a loose hide, you can create fitted clothing, boots that trap heat, gloves that protect your fingers, layered garments that keep warm air close to your body. Researchers studying traditional Arctic clothing have found that carefully sewn animal skins can provide extraordinary insulation, sometimes rivaling modern cold weather equipment under certain conditions. Winter wasn't survived through strength alone. It was survived one stitch at a time. One improved design passed from parent to child. One lesson remembered before the first snow returned. But staying warm was only half the battle. Finding food after the landscape froze required an entirely different kind of intelligence. And that's where winter became one of humanity's greatest teachers. Imagine standing at the edge of a frozen valley. At first it looks empty. Nothing moves, no birds sing, the trees stand perfectly still beneath layers of snow. To most people today, it would seem like a lifeless landscape. But an experienced Ice Age hunter would see something completely different. Every footprint written into the snow was information. A fresh line of reindeer tracks told you which direction the herd had gone. A set of deep hoof prints suggested heavy animals, probably worth following. Small tracks disappearing beneath a fallen log might reveal rabbits hiding from the cold. And a single oversized paw print could tell you something far more important. A predator had passed through. Fresh snow turned the landscape into a giant map. In some ways, winter actually made tracking easier than summer. Instead of disappearing into dry soil or thick grass, every movement remained visible for hours, sometimes even days if the weather stayed calm. Anthropologists studying modern indigenous tracking communities have shown that experienced trackers can estimate an animal's speed, size, direction, and even its behavior from remarkably small details. While we can't know exactly how Ice Age hunters interpreted every trail, it's likely they developed equally sophisticated skills over thousands of generations. But here's where the story changes. Even the greatest tracker can't guarantee a successful hunt. Sometimes the herd never appears. Sometimes another predator reaches it first. Sometimes a blizzard erases every footprint overnight. Winter demanded something more reliable than hope. It demanded preparation. One successful hunt had to last as long as possible. Cold temperatures naturally slowed decay, but people still needed ways to preserve food beyond a few freezing days. Across northern climates, freezing air acted like nature's refrigerator. Elsewhere, drying and smoking meat likely became essential techniques. Although organic materials rarely survived for archaeologists to study directly, later hunter-gatherer societies across Europe, Asia, and North America relied heavily on these methods, suggesting deep prehistoric roots. The goal wasn't comfort, it was time. Every extra day a piece of meat remained edible gave your family another chance to survive. And winter wasn't only hard on people, large animals struggled too. Deep snow forced them to burn more energy simply to move. Food became harder to reach. Weak animals slowed down. Experienced hunters understood this. Instead of relying on speed, they relied on strategy. Groups could guide herds toward narrow valleys, frozen rivers, steep slopes, or natural bottlenecks where escape became much more difficult. It's the same lesson we see again and again throughout human history. Humans rarely won because they were stronger. They won because they planned together. One hunter watched from higher ground, another waited farther ahead, others quietly closed the gaps. Success belonged to the entire group. And when the hunt was finally over, the work had only begun. The animal had to be butchered before freezing temperatures made the task harder. The meat had to be divided, the hide carefully removed without damaging it. Bones split for nutritious marrow. Useful tendons separated for sewing. Nothing could be wasted. At sites like the Yana River settlements in Arctic Siberia, dating back around 32,000 years, archaeologists found evidence that humans were already living far above the Arctic Circle. Think about that for a moment. These people survived winters where temperatures could fall far below anything most of us have ever experienced. They did it without electricity, without metal tools, without insulated houses. They succeeded through planning, cooperation, and an astonishing understanding of their environment. But winter changed more than hunting. It changed how people spent their time. By late afternoon, darkness settled over the landscape. Long before clocks existed, winter naturally shortened the working day outdoors. So, what happened inside the shelter? The archaeological record gives us an unexpected answer. Work never stopped. Excavations at Ice Age camps repeatedly uncover piles of stone flakes, unfinished tools, broken bone needles, carved antler, and manufacturing debris clustered around ancient hearths. These weren't simply places where people slept, they were workshops. When storms kept everyone inside, people repaired weapons, sharpened blades, prepared hides, twisted plant fibers into cord, carved new spear points. Everything damaged during the previous hunting season had to be ready before spring returned. Because once the migrating herds came back, there would be no time left for repairs. Winter became humanity's maintenance season. But perhaps the most important work happening beside the fire wasn't making tools, it was making knowledge. Children watched every movement. How to sharpen stone without breaking it, how to stitch a hide so cold air couldn't reach the skin, how to recognize dangerous animal tracks, how to keep a fire burning through the longest night. These weren't lessons taught in classrooms. They were survival itself. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies have found that storytelling and teaching often become central activities whenever harsh weather limits travel. The pattern makes perfect sense. When movement slows, learning speeds up. And every story carried a purpose. Some explained where the herds returned each year. Others warned about dangerous rivers hidden beneath thin ice. Some preserved memories of extraordinary winters that older generations had survived. Long before writing, information lived inside people. If those stories disappeared, so did the knowledge. That's one reason researchers believe oral traditions became such powerful survival tools. The fire wasn't just providing heat, it was preserving memory. And here's something remarkable. Some of the oldest verified oral traditions on Earth come from Aboriginal Australian communities, preserving memories of rising sea levels that occurred thousands of years ago. Different environment, different climate, same human ability. Knowledge could survive far longer than any individual. Winter gave people the time to pass it on, because in the end, a sharpened spear might feed your family for one season. But a lesson remembered by the next generation could feed them for hundreds. But there's one part of winter that rarely appears in movies: silence. After a heavy snowfall, the world changes. Snow absorbs sound, forests become strangely quiet, the wind slows, and even familiar places feel unfamiliar. For ancient humans, that silence wasn't peaceful. It was unsettling. You couldn't always hear an approaching predator. You couldn't always tell where the herd had gone. Sometimes the only sound was the crackling fire behind you and the wind moving across the frozen valley. And in that silence, another challenge emerged. People got sick. We don't know exactly how Ice Age communities treated illness, but archaeology offers remarkable clues about something even more important. They cared for each other. One of the most famous examples comes from Shanidar Cave in northern Iraq. Researchers discovered the remains of a Neanderthal known as Shanidar I, who survived for years despite suffering injuries that would have made hunting almost impossible. He had severe damage to one arm, injuries to his leg, and signs of partial blindness. He couldn't have survived alone. Someone gathered food for him, someone protected him, someone kept him alive. And Shanidar isn't the only example. At the site of Sungir in Russia, archaeologists uncovered elaborate burials dating to around 34,000 years ago. Some individuals were buried with thousands of carefully crafted ivory beads, each one requiring hours of work to produce. These discoveries suggest that even during the harsh conditions of the Ice Age, people invested extraordinary time and care in one another. That's easy to overlook. When we think about prehistoric survival, we usually imagine strength. The archaeological record keeps pointing towards something else. Cooperation. Winter made selfishness expensive. If one person couldn't gather firewood, someone else had to. If a hunter was injured, the rest of the group still needed to eat. If the fire started dying in the middle of the night, somebody had to wake up and feed it. No one survived an Ice Age winter alone, and perhaps that's the biggest misconception about ancient humans. We picture them as lonely figures wandering through frozen wilderness. The evidence tells a different story. They lived in communities. They shared work. They shared food. Most importantly, they shared knowledge. Every generation inherited thousands of tiny lessons. Which trees burned hottest? Which valleys filled with drifting snow? Which caves stayed dry during storms? Which animal migrations could be trusted? And which couldn't? No single lesson changed history, but together they transformed a tropical primate into a species capable of living from the African savanna to the Arctic tundra. That's an extraordinary achievement. Humans didn't grow thick fur. We didn't develop longer claws. We didn't become faster than wolves or stronger than bears. Instead, we became better at solving problems. Every winter forced people to ask the same question. How do we make next year easier than this one? Sometimes the answer was a better spear. Sometimes it was warmer clothing. Sometimes it was discovering a new hunting route or a safer shelter. And sometimes it was simply telling a child the right story at the right moment. Over thousands of generations, those small improvements accumulated. One better stitch became tailored clothing. One smarter hunting strategy became reliable food supplies. One carefully remembered story became generations of survival knowledge. Civilization didn't appear all at once. It was built one winter at a time. Today, when the first snow falls, most of us check the weather forecast on our phones. We order groceries without leaving the house. We turn up the heating with the push of a button. Winter still changes our routines, but it rarely decides whether we'll see spring. Your ancestors lived in a completely different world. Every stack of firewood represented another week of life. Every repaired boot protected feet that might walk hundreds of miles before the snow melted. Every sharpened spear carried the hope of another successful hunt. Every evening around the fire became an opportunity to pass knowledge from one generation to the next. And maybe that's winter's greatest legacy. It didn't just test human survival. It accelerated human ingenuity. It rewarded patience over panic, preparation over luck, cooperation over competition. The same qualities that helped small groups survive freezing nights would eventually help build villages, cities, civilizations, and the modern world. So the next time you watch snow falling outside your window, remember this. For hundreds of thousands of years, that same snowfall wasn't simply weather. It was the season that quietly shaped who we became. Because when spring finally returned, the people who stepped back into the sunlight weren't just the strongest. They were the best prepared. And that might be the most human survival strategy of all.